At this point in the program, we've had a number of conversations on where we are today and what the challenges and opportunities facing us are. We want to cap this off with a conversation on one of the most critical, big picture questions of our time. How do we define the value that innovative new treatments and cures bring to the evolving healthcare landscape? And joining us this morning are folks who represent the various viewpoints that must come together to ensure companies continue to be incentivized to find cures and equally important, that patients continue to have access to them. And I'd like to invite Bill Sibbald, Genzyme's head of MS, to the stage to introduce the panelists. Come on up, Bill.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, I am Bill Sibbald from Genzyme, head up their MS franchise, and it's a very active time for us right now. We have 2 launches of 2 multiple sclerosis products going on globally. So overall, about 50 launches are going on at this time around the world. And this notion, this question of value is something that is on the table for us every day and has been on the table every day for us over the last 2 years. I think Bob said it very well. Looking ahead, this question of value is a very important one. And most importantly, for this industry, to me, it's a question of sustainability. This is hard to describe, I believe, the value that this industry actually provides to society overall. And I think you're hard-pressed to find another industry that adds as much value to the world. And sometimes we have some problems in actually trying to explain that value to the world. So as we've organized this panel today, we have people from various parts of healthcare that are going to join me on stage. And what we're going to do is we're going to make this very informal. We're just going to sit around. We're going to ask a few questions. We're going to ask for the audience to participate and ask the questions that you may have as well. But there is something that isn't quite right when we have the image around the world that we do at times. You know, last week we had a great article that came out talking about promise and hope in Alzheimer's disease, but that's followed by months of debate around another incredibly promising therapy, Sovaldi. And so what happens between that early promise and now when we start to get to a debate, which becomes one very focused single product and single price, if you will? And that is something that the industry overall has to grapple with, because we have had a very proud 30 years, and it's really quite an achievement when you think back of what's been accomplished. 30 years from now, what's this industry going to look like? The sustainability of this industry. We want this ballroom. We don't want to be at this hotel in 30 years. We want to be at a much bigger convention center because the industry is thriving so much and that this part of healthcare is being recognized. So I'm going to invite the panel on stage. First of all, Sarah Emond. She's the Chief Operating Officer of the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. Chris Hansen is the President of the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network. And obviously, no introduction, Glenn Batchelder is the Chairman of the MassBio Board of Directors. So I'm going to have us all come over here. I will join my colleagues on stage, and we'll get started. Chris,
thank
please.
you, thank you.
And I think what we'll do, just so everyone has a little bit more background, you heard from me what I do, what I focus on. If we could just ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their background. So why don't we start, Glenn, with you?
Thank you. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk about this very important subject today. So I'm Glenn Batchelder. I started my biotech career back at Millennium Pharmaceuticals over 15 years ago, at a very, very different time in the industry. From there, I had the opportunity to go be the initial CEO of a company called Acceleron Pharma, which is a public company today, doing very well. And then I was the founding CEO of a second company, Bind Therapeutics, a nanoparticle technology company focused on cancer, which is also a public company today, doing well. And then most recently, I was the founder and CEO of a company called Civitas Therapeutics, where we developed a Parkinson's therapy. And it was in the midst of development, and a larger company came along, Accorda Therapeutics, and decided they wanted to buy us, which was actually a good day for our investors and a good day probably for patients in the end, because it took a smaller company and incorporated into a bigger company that really had the infrastructure to take the final stage of development and then launch the product successfully. So over that period of time, it's been very interesting to see how the landscape is changing. We were chatting earlier about, back in the early days, there was pharma, and then there were all us little biotechs, and that the way pharma looked at us is kind of interesting, and they sometimes had good ideas, kind of thing. And through that, sort of time, now we look out, and I think the biotech industry and pharma are very much partners, and I think both have learned from each other, and in many ways, pharma in the notion of how we think about the value proposition, how important it is what we're doing in the world for patients is something they have really internalized, where if you reel back 10 years around the sort of pharma, the trade organization pharma, the table, and how people would have discussed it, it would be very different than what you'd hear today. It would be much more about how do we keep our leverage as opposed to how do we actually make better therapies for patients, how do we create value for patients. So I think that's very healthy, because now I believe for the most part we're all in the same boat, which is a good thing.
Good. Sarah, why don't we turn to you?
Sure. Sarah Emond, I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. I will affectionately call ICER because it's such a mouthful. ICER's been around for a while, and we're an independent nonprofit, and the goal and the mission is really to help improve the quality and the value of the healthcare choices that are available. It really has to do with both the conduct of comparative effectiveness research as well as the dissemination and implementation of that research. We have two main programs that will probably come up throughout the conversation today, and I'll just quickly mention them. One's in California, the California Technology Assessment Forum, and one in New England, the New England Comparative Effectiveness Public Advisory Council, because we've taken the conversation about what is value and how do you judge it into the public sphere. And we at ICER produce reports for those meetings, and independent panel judges the clinical evidence as well as the comparative value, and then we work with stakeholders to help change medical policy to reflect that, those paradigms, those deliberations. And so we have a vested interest in this conversation because we understand that there are many different stakeholders trying to come up with a way to demonstrate the value of their products, pay for products in a limited budget, whether you're a state Medicaid program or an ACO, and then patients who really don't care because they want to be able to get access to the drugs that their doctors are prescribing for them. So we hope to be that bridge.
Great. Chris.
Okay, so I am, as Bill said, I'm the president of the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network. We are the advocacy and policy affiliate of the American Cancer Society. We represent patient interests, but I think we represent much more than that, because ultimately, if the whole, in our case, cancer ecosystem doesn't work, it doesn't work. So it has to work for physicians, and it has to work for providers, payers, patients, et cetera, and that's pretty much the perspective that we have. I'm probably a little bit of an unlikely person to be doing what I'm doing, partly because before I did this, I was the CEO of the American Electronics Association, and we merged 4 trade associations together to create Tech America, which is now part of CompTIA, because we were starting that merger as well. But we used to do financial conferences for technology companies, which included a lot of biotech companies, and it gave me a little bit of insight into some of the challenges that this industry has in terms of raising the capital that you need to do what you need to do. Let me go back a little further. I actually spent almost all of my career in the aerospace industry. I was a senior vice president of the Boeing company. I retired from Boeing actually and was an absolutely dismal failure at retirement. So I decided that I needed to re-engage and do it in something that had a mission involved. But it gave me an appreciation for industries that are required to do a lot of investment to be able to do what they need to be able to do. That was certainly true on the commercial side of the company. And I'll stop there, but I just want to say that I agree very much with the statement that Bill made up front about the value of this industry. And I have to say, from our point of view, this industry is absolutely critical to us.
Great. And Chris, could you just comment? I think you said that you actually started your career in the medical space a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean,
well,
we don't want you to get away and think that it's just an airplane guy up here. It goes certainly beyond that.
No, I had actually, I was born about 1.5 miles from here, and when I graduated from college, in between college and graduate school, I needed to earn some money, and my parents lived in Needham, Massachusetts. I came back here and got a job as a salesperson for Ortho Diagnostics, which was a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson. And I loved it. The problem is they hired me to replace somebody who wound up not moving out of the job. So, because he was supposed to go to a new subsidiary, and so what they, because I wanted to go to graduate school, what they did is they basically said, look, if you go to graduate school, we'll guarantee you a job when you come back. And then when it came time to come back, my old boss said, if I were you, I wouldn't come back. I think you can do better than that. And I went into the aerospace industry. But I have to say, I saw enough of Ortho Diagnostics, I saw enough of Johnson & Johnson, saw enough of the industry that I start off with a very high regard for industries that operate in the medical world. And I'll say this one other thing. Aerospace is complicated. The defense and intelligence part of aerospace is very complicated. And I remember when I first started getting into the healthcare space, people saying, you're going to find that healthcare is far more complicated. And I didn't believe it completely initially. I do believe it now. So it is.
Great. Well, great, thanks. So I think I'd like to start a little bit with you, Glenn, and because you have a very unique perspective. And I think, first of all, as you look across the panel here, everyone has a little bit different take as a different stakeholder. And so I think we have a very broad group that can really get to the heart of this matter. But, Glenn, you've been involved in starting many companies that have evolved into much larger companies. And that's been over a period of time. And how would you say the dialogue, when has that dialogue about value started now versus in the early companies that you were involved with? And I'm particularly looking at from a funding perspective. So obviously we've got a very active, healthy venture capital community here. How has that dialogue changed over time?
So relative to the notion of value, it's very dramatic. It's a completely different conversation when I'm going out to raise funding for my next company, as opposed to it was for the first one. So the first one, Acceleron was a little over 10 years ago now. And at that time, we had some very interesting drugs that had to do with osteoporosis and muscle, but no one really ever asked us about how we were thinking about the commercial dimension and how they'd be priced and how they would compare to other drugs. There was a sense of that, but it was really not about the value. Whereas Real Forward today, it's right there, even if you're at the very beginning of almost call it a science project company. The notion of how will this in some way fit into that broader landscape, and why will people pay the premium required to justify all the investment to get there. So it's really night and day. And some of the maybe the one other dimension of that is I remember when I was at Millennium and we launched Velcade, so that was in 2003, we were sitting there really debating whether, and I believe the number was, $24,000 per cycle was just too high, and in terms of the landscape of cancer therapies, and geez, how did that fit in? And we were very, engaged with CMS around that. And now you look at where we are today, and when cancer therapies come out, they are, sort of generally $100,000 is, I think, how it tends to work out per year. And so it's a very interesting time, and Mark Levin, who was up on the stage yesterday, talked about the notion that really part of our challenges as we think about, it's not just, with cancer therapies, we realize the combinations are really at the core of what's going to succeed. So you pile a $100,000 therapy on top of a $100,000 therapy on top of a $100,000 therapy, and all of a sudden you're really at a place where you have to step back and think about it. So it's very important in terms of how we think about the whole value proposition, but a number of pieces of this have changed, both the world's focus on this, but also how we think about pricing things.
Mm-hmm. And Sarah, obviously you're working with an organization now that the focus is trying to define this and understand it. So what was the turning point, would you say? When did this question become so much more front and center?
In some ways, I think it has been a bit gradual, yet over the last 12 months with Sovaldi and Hep C, it really became less gradual, and it became more of a, we have to deal with this now. I think there were so many things happening in the broader landscape at the same time that had something to do with the tipping point, if you will. So ICER's been around since 2007. Issues of how to pay for new medications and new innovations, new surgery techniques have been around for a long time. But as we saw the increase in the percentage of GDP devoted to healthcare spending, we started seeing more questions about how are we spending those dollars. And so I think since we've moved or are moving away from fee-for-service medicine towards more global and capitated payments, you see people who have more interest in understanding what the value of a new innovation is. And so when Sovaldi came out last year, and I will say, it's a perfect example, and I'm not picking on Sovaldi in any way. And Gilead actually has been a fantastic partner to ICER, and we've collaborated with them on some of our analyses. It was a nice round number. It was $1,000 a pill. And so it made for good headlines, and it brought to bear something that we hadn't dealt with and that hasn't really happened in the oncology space, which is a huge patient population. So I really think that when you were looking at 3 to 5 million eligible patients, depending on how you do the count, and something that cost $1,000 a day and upwards of, between $80,000 and $100,000 per course of treatment, people started doing the math. And so one of the things that Glenn said that I really appreciated was it used to be about proving the value of your particular drug and your particular intervention, and I think it's changing to how does that drug or intervention fit in the entire healthcare system. And so we look at value in two ways. What's the clinical care value, or just the care value? Does it work? Is it cost effective? What additional benefits does it have? What contextual considerations should we make? But then you also can look at the affordability piece of it, and you can look at a budget impact. Okay, so I'm a Medicaid department in Massachusetts, or actually in California is where we did the analysis, and if they offered Sovaldi to everyone who was eligible, it would have increased the premiums, or how much they spend per month per person, by over 5%, 30%, depending on how you did the math. And so they didn't have anywhere to get that money from. And so this idea of health system value, I think, is becoming more incumbent on industry to understand how their products fit into the health system, not just the clinical care value piece.
Okay. Chris, you obviously have a patient perspective with the group that you represent. And how are patients thinking about this? What are you hearing from patients about the overall value equation and how they're looking at it?
Well, and remember, the patients we're talking about are cancer patients. So what cancer patients want is access. But access means a whole variety of things. Access means, can they afford it? Is it covered? It means, is it there? Has it been developed yet? If you have a certain kind of cancer, I could give you a long, long list that would take up the next several weeks of cancer patients who've been in contact with us because they want to know about what's in the pipeline for the cancer that they're dealing with. So I think they're very focused on when am I going to have access to something that doesn't now exist. So it's not a simple answer, and I think that people who talk only about the cost of a medication or something like that, I think are misunderstanding the equation, in my opinion.
And you obviously, through your efforts, extend far beyond purely medication. Can you just talk a little bit about the approach you're taking from a more holistic perspective?
Well, yeah, we get involved in a whole variety of interests because I think we want the whole landscape to work for providers, for payers, for everybody who's involved in trying to stop suffering and death due to cancer. But I would also say, if I were to only talk about the research part of it, you know, we advocate, actually, I don't know if it made any news up here, we just did an event in Washington, D.C. a week ago Tuesday with a very large event. We had senators, congressmen, Republicans, Democrats, all joining us asking for a specific amount of money that we want to put into NIH and the National Cancer Institute. We also had people from the entertainment community. We had Pierce Brosnan and, for instance, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who's dealing with cancer right now. Fairly recognizable. He's the only human being I've ever been next to where I was looking at his belt the whole time I was talking about it. But we were trying to say that, you know, 90,000 Americans are going to die of cancer this year. Half of those deaths are totally preventable with what we know how to do today. If you get people to stop smoking, smoking is responsible for 1/3 of all cancer deaths today. Also, and this may surprise some people, probably not a lot of people in this room, but I think it would surprise other people in other rooms, about 30% of those deaths you can actually trace back to obesity and people having poor nutrition and not exercising, et cetera. And unfortunately, that problem is getting far worse. We have not turned the corner on that at all. And then you want people to get screenings that are available. But then there's the other half, and the other half we have to solve with research. And I think the research equation in my mind is partly basic science that only the federal government has enough resource to do. And I think that we've got to make sure that we do that, and that we do that now that we have the advantage of having an understanding of genomic medicine. I think that we are at a tipping point, but my fear is that the public won't understand the rest of the equation, which is you. That it doesn't ever get to them if you just do that. That somebody else has got to invest in turning it into a product. And I've lived in that space in the aerospace world. You know, we had research that the government did. We didn't talk about it a lot because we were always fighting Airbus over subsidies, and the minute we talk about it, they would turn that into a subsidy, which I don't think it was. But we needed the basic science to be done, and in cases where the federal government wouldn't do it, we would do it ourselves. But every time we did that, every time we invested like that, our stock typically would go down. We all had to swallow hard. But we knew there was a product there. The only time that we invested in R&D and didn't wind up with a product was when we discovered that the market wasn't quite right, and we wouldn't launch a product. But over 90% of the time when we started spending R&D, we wound up building an airplane. I have enormous empathy for this industry because you're not in that situation. And I really wish the public at large understood that so that they could understand the entire equation. I'm sorry, I think I went off course.
It's quite all right. It was riveting. So I think it was actually very good.
And maybe I think that Chris, you bring up a great point. And you know, as I talked sort of a little before about the sort of the value equation, how we present it, and also how prices have changed in terms of how you set prices. But a big part of that is what it costs to bring a drug to market. So, you know, the numbers that are out there, and there are different groups who come up with different numbers. But back 10 years ago, it was more something like $500 million, and now using the same sort of metrics and looking at all you know, through the same lens, it looks like it's $2 billion. So part of our challenge is how do we deal with the fact that the costs going up, and that because this is funded through the private sector, there has to be a return if people are going to take the risks, and that's the only way this works. So that's a very important part of the equation. And sort of there's a number of pieces of promise out there, and part of it is also this notion of what's been coined precision medicine. So if we end up taking these very expensive drugs, but having a very clear reason to give it to a particular individual as opposed to running through a regimen and trying one thing after another to see which one hits, that can direct that expenditure to somebody who's really going to benefit versus it being something where you are both giving people things they don't need, which is very unpleasant for the patient generally as well, but also not economically efficient. So I'm hopeful that that will help change this equation. So.
Yeah, because something's breaking down along the way here. We talk about the great value. We have everyone here who, when you personalize it, and you think about yourself, think about family members and friends, you understand very quickly when you're in need the value. But something's happening, and we're not being recognized for that. And in the MassBio 2020 report, which is a very comprehensive, great report that I would urge everyone to take a look at, one of the comments talks how over time our leading companies have gone from the most admired companies to, quoting one executive, are easy to dislike now. So as we enter this discussion of value from at the very end of the game, so to speak, when we're talking about here's a product, here's what its price is, to what extent is it more of a commentary and reaction to how they're thinking about companies overall and what companies are doing? Because I think it's it's late in the game when you get to market and you have something that you're then introducing and proposing to the community. So to what extent is this negative perception of industry, first of all, kind of what's driving it, and how much is that driving the ultimate discussion that we have as it relates to therapies when they become available? And maybe, Sarah, could you comment from your perspective?
I was thinking about this, was one of the questions we talked about as we're preparing for the panel, and I think something that was happening more broadly as we see this switch from being more admired to less admired is that a lot of patients are now tasked with making decisions with their healthcare dollars that they never had to make before. So with the increase in high deductible health plans, with large co-insurance on the medical and the drug benefit, you've got patients who are coming at this going, well, now I want to know what my money is going towards. And we all had a luxury when we had sort of the same copay no matter what, and there was no such thing as value-based insurance design, that we trusted our doctor to give us the recommendation for the highest value option. We just sort of assumed that. But when you are faced with a $5,000 deductible, and that's real money to your family, then you want to demonstrate, you want someone to demonstrate to you if that's worth your money, so to speak. And so I think that as the headlines have increased about some of the costs of these drugs, the prices of these drugs, that's coincided with people taking more ownership for spending their healthcare dollars, and so they want more information. I want to also say, though, that's a really hard burden to put on a patient, and they're not trained in medicine, most of them, and there aren't a lot of great resources for them to understand the comparative value, if it's a drug or if it's a surgical technique. And so I think that we've gone a little too far in giving the responsibility to them without any of the resources or the tools they need to be able to make that decision. But then they see a headline about a $1,000 a day pill, and they're like, well, why does it have to cost that much? Because that's going to cost me $5,000 out of pocket just to treat my hep C. And so I think that there are other things happening in the broader landscape at the same time that has then made the focus on the drug companies maybe in more of a negative light. But it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that we're thinking about the discussion as a more broad one, and these drugs don't come to market without someone investing time and money in them. And so how do we have that conversation with consumers?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a great point, and I think part of the solution lies in the patient advocacy group. So yesterday we had this remarkable talk by Kathy Gusti, who's the head of the Multiple Myeloma Foundation. So she was very involved with us at Millennium and was actually one of my really early inspirations for what we do. And when she got up in front of a group of 1,000 technology folks essentially at the time and really drove home the patient perspective, because Kathy is, who's been living with multiple myeloma now for over 15 years, I believe, and it used to have an average life expectancy of about 3 years, and Velcade was one of the key parts of how that changed. But what she does is they actually work with patients and work with researchers and bring everybody collectively together to understand kind of the messiness of developing a drug and how hard it is, and what, creating sort of longitudinal databases and tissue banks that help target patients better or understand how to target patients. And I just recently joined the board of the Michael J. Fox Foundation, where Michael J. Fox similarly struck with it. Parkinson's disease at an early age, and has turned that into one of the great contributions somebody could make to the world. And he does very much what the Multiple Myeloma Foundation. So they engage the patients in the process of getting at how their disease. And I think then when somebody says it's $1,000 a pill, that patient will have a lot more context about why it's that, because they're reading all the stuff on the websites and they're seeing things fail and they're seeing things succeed. And I think the more that they're a part of the conversation, the more that whole connectivity, that pact with broader society, where if we change patients' lives, society will be willing to write those extra checks, whether it's out of their personal checkbook for a drug or whether it's in taxes, that they will understand that. And to me, that is probably our most critical challenge as an industry, is finding a way to strengthen that pact with society.
Yeah, which is brings up a very good point about how we can change this picture going forward. And just want to read one thing from the MassBio 2020 report again. Quote, "Zero-sum arguments on a product-by-product basis are not sufficient. Industry leaders must be present at the table, avoid the temptation to prioritize short-term solutions, leverage their collective financial resources to investigate new algorithms, and direct talented managers to advance this effort." End of quote. I think that really gets to this whole notion of engagement with stakeholders, not only at the end, but at the very early stage, and being a part of the dialogue rather than coin a phrase, burying your head in the sand and then lifting it up at the end. So, Sarah, just in our conversations, you've talked about that broad stakeholder engagement. And, while things often end up with a discussion about the price of drugs, drugs, as we look over the course of healthcare systems around the world, are pretty consistently in that 10% of the total healthcare cost. So clearly, there's 90% that remains, and this stakeholder discussion has to take place. So just open up to the panel the discussion about going forward, the responsibility and how we can work differently with stakeholders, who those stakeholders are.
If you don't mind, I'd love to take a shot at that. I think one of the things, ICER's mission has always been multi-stakeholder, and so we involve manufacturers, health plans, consumers, medical societies in all of our reviews and helping us define the research questions. And then on the implementation side, I think that one of the things that we're seeing, and whether it's 10 or 20% of the total spending, drugs do get a lot of the attention because they do make for easy headlines. But we look at things besides drugs at ICER. We look at health system interventions. We look at diagnostics. We look at surgical interventions. I think one of the things we're hoping to do with some of the work that we've done on defining a value assessment framework is bring some transparency to how all of the different stakeholders are thinking about value. A lot of the conversations that have happened to date have been a bit of a black box. So a new drug comes to a formulary decision team at a pharmacy benefit manager, and they make a determination about its clinical effectiveness and its value, and then they decide whether or not to put it on formulary and what tier. They've never had any obligation to make any of those discussions public. What resources did they use to make their decision? What metrics did they use to assess value? So our value assessment framework is is we hope, a bridge that will allow manufacturers to understand how different stakeholders are going to be assessing value so that they can build that into the clinical trial design. So if we look at something like the cost per liver transplant avoided, and Gilead knows that that's going to be one of the major metrics that people are going to want to look at when they're assessing the comparative value of the new drugs for Hep C. That's something that they can gather data on and present to a health insurer or to a pharmacy benefit manager. So our goal has always been that the multi-stakeholder approach really does benefit everybody, because the more manufacturers know about what's happening behind the curtain at the insurance company, the better they can improve and change their clinical development paradigm in order to produce the results that will make it really easy for the health plan to say yes to a new drug.
Great. Any other comments on the panel to that?
I might just, I think one of the things is that the patient population at large doesn't understand all these metrics. They don't understand what it takes to develop these things. No, I don't think anybody's ever told them. Mm-hmm. They don't see it in popular media. They know what touches them. They know what impacts their access. They know what it costs them, whether they have coverage or not for that. I think, and I'll say something that may turn out to be totally irrelevant, and if it is, forgive me for this, but I know when I was at Boeing, we didn't sell anything directly to consumers. We sold airplanes to airlines, and we sold other things to governments. But we cared a lot about our image. We cared a lot about whether or not we were an admired company or not. That was one of our metrics every single year about where we showed up on the Fortune 500 most admired companies list. We decided when we were developing the 777 program to allow PBS to come in and basically tape and be there for every single meeting that we had in the development of that aircraft. And we had a very vigorous debate about it because we thought, well, what if something goes wrong? Mm-hmm. They're going to be sitting there with their cameras. I mean, there's a lot of risk in that. And we thought, yeah, but, we think we can handle that. And so we did it. And they did the special. It was a very popular special when one of the launch customers was United Airlines. The airplane was so popular when it first came out that United Airlines had to have a separate reservation line just for 777 reservations. But the fact of the matter is they saw everything. And it was turned out to be a very popular show, and it helped people to really understand all of the things that we went through when we were trying to develop an aircraft. I don't think the public at large really has any understanding of the things that you all deal with. I don't think they have any understanding of the kinds of decision points that you come to. I don't think they understand any of that. And even as they have to assess how these products work for them and what they're going to do and what they can afford, which is a huge consideration, I think it would be much better if they had a better understanding about where this stuff comes from and what's involved.
Very good.
And I think, and Bill, you and I were speaking about earlier how sort of the world has changed. I referred to it a little at the beginning of my comments, which is back in time there was, and I think even the big pharma folks who were back then would acknowledge it, there was a bit of hubris in those companies that served them very poorly in the late 90s, where they got disconnected from how people really felt about what they were doing, and part of it was because of the way patients paid for the drugs. They didn't really feel the cost, so they got very used to that and figuring somebody was going to absorb it, and that biotech came along, really highlighting all this sort of great science, and people run around in tennis shoes rather than fancy shoes and ties, and what's happened is if you look at, so pharma was the trade organization for the big pharmaceutical companies, then you had bio, which was for all the biotechs. Well, now if you look at the biotech roster, it's full of pharmaceutical companies as members. In fact, I think they're almost all members of bio, and there's been an appreciation for the need to really become an admired company. And I think it really is critical. And one of the things that actually Bob Coughlin, our president and CEO of MassBio, has done a great job of, is really taking this all back to the patient. That every conversation we have at a MassBio board meeting starts and ends with, how does this affect the patient? And that's what we're trying to do, is take all the stakeholders, the doctors, the hospitals, the venture guys, the pharmaceutical companies, the biotech companies, the patient advocacy groups, and pull them all together so that we're in this together and really keep it front of mind of that every day we get up, it's really about the patients. And going back to Mark Levin, who is really one of my mentors and heroes in many respects, as a guy who has always sort of thought about things that way, and as he starts each of his little companies, as a venture person, he picks people based on the fact that they want to help patients. If somebody comes in and says, I want to do this and it's going to make you a lot of money, he really doesn't have a lot of time for that.
Can I dovetail on something Glenn said?
And then also, I'd just like to say, if we could have the MassBio team with the microphones just go around and people could identify themselves for questions. We'll get to that right after this comment, Sarah.
I think it's such a great point that Glenn is making, and I think the other thing that's been happening is that people are starting to recognize that somebody has to pay for it. And so I think when we think about the spending we do on healthcare, and we think about the other things we're not spending on, like maybe the tea, if anyone suffered through that this winter, and education and other infrastructure, it's so important to be having the conversation at the patient level about what value means to them and to the system at large, because the money has to come from somewhere. And one of the things that's so core to our mission at ICER is that it's not about saying no. We've had many reports and meetings where we've said yes to new interventions because they represent both high clinical effectiveness and then high system value. And that's a way to ensure that we have money for all of these great new innovations that are in the pipeline and coming out. And so it's not about saying no, and I just want to make sure I clarified that.
Great. I think that's a good point to ask the audience if there's any questions that you have for the panel at the moment. Up front here, let's get you a microphone. In front, please.
Racist.
Now you have two microphones.
Stereo.
So I'm very new in this industry, and the past 2 years, I had to go with one of my family members who hold the cancer care, and I'm very new to the U.S. structure as well, and U.S. healthcare system, which I'm coming from Europe, which is completely different healthcare system there, and the government always paying everything or not paying nothing because they don't have resources, depending. So, and when we went to start speaking with the doctors, it was not about that, okay, there are two options the insurance paying, right? So for that cancer, breast cancer treatment, and you at that moment, because I was not in the industry, maybe I could ask more questions to them right now than 2 years ago. You just say, okay, these are two drugs there, and these are what the insurance paying. So my question will be here is that, what's the insurance role here, insurance company's role? And the value is basically, of course the patient's value needs to be driven, but as well as the whole insurance industry really influencing the whole drug market. And I have been trying to figure out how the insurance has been working here, even being now in this industry. It's still a mystery for me. Mm-hmm. What's the percentage of the insurance paying company, and this is what the patient will take, right? So, and so when you do the value definition, what's the insurance role in this?
It's a great question. Could I take a shot? And it is a tough transition going from a European model to trying to understand the US model, so I completely sympathize. The health insurers, the answer is probably it depends. A lot of the health insurance companies that we've worked with and who've been part of our appraisals and our work before are really dedicated to getting access to treatments for their members. They don't want to be in the position of saying no. It's an uncomfortable position for them. It causes high administrative burden for them to put in a prior auth or a step therapy. So that raises costs. They're not interested in that. A lot of them now, well, they all have the medical loss ratio to think about because of the Affordable Care Act. They've been scrambling for a way to bring transparency and uniformity to how they do these decisions in order to make it easier for people to understand why they might say only those with severe liver disease can get access to Sovaldi right now. Because if I give everyone access to Sovaldi who has Hep C, I'm going to have to increase your premiums by 5%. And so, and their customers are us as individuals, but also purchasers. And the purchasers are putting a lot of demands on them saying, I don't want any premium increase year over year of more than 5%. And they go, okay, well that money has to come from somewhere. And so I don't think that they sit there and think, well, how much can I cost shift to the patient, or how much can I save if I say no to this drug? They want to say yes to the innovations, and they want to have a way to evaluate them that's consistent and transparent. Not all of them. They're all, I admit that some of them have a different sort of metric when they're thinking about their internal decisions. Some of them have a lot more resources than others. And so if you're Anthem and you're part of the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, you've got an entire tech assessment facility and machine that gives you the information you have. But if you're a small regional plan, you might have 3 people working in your pharmacy benefit management, and they don't have the resource to do the great analysis that your mom or your sister deserved when they were thinking about whether or not to cover that breast cancer drug. So I think they're all looking for a better way to do it and a better metric.
And I guess, so this is sort of, it's sort of an interesting thing, because a lot of times insurance companies are really are seen as the bad guy, but as Sarah is saying, they really don't, that isn't their goal in life, and these people get up in the morning trying to do good things and the right things for patients. But it's an interesting, as you think about value, we were talking a little about this about medicines yesterday, which is when it's your own family and it's your own life or your own loved one, there's no value equation. You want that person to get better, you want them to live, you want them to be pain-free. And this whole kind of, it's important, and co-pays play into that, but if it's really the difference between life or death or extraordinary suffering, there really isn't one. And so then the insurance companies, on the other hand, have to balance the broader perspective. And as Sarah said, are they going to have to raise their premiums next year 5%, or is it 20%? And then that has happened. Mm-hmm. And so then they're dealing with sort of the collective market of saying, customers will not buy our plans anymore if they're starting to rise at 20%, so I have to find a way. So it's that, as sort of maligned as our system is in terms of the market forces, in the end, it's a very interesting balance between the personal value proposition, which is the most important thing as my loved one, to then you making a broader decision about which, at a company or as an individual, which plan you take on, which is then making these other assessments. So I think there's a lot to be said for our system, as complex as it is, because it allows those 2 different factors, the individual and the collective, and us to participate in both parts of the market, one in the long view and one in the immediate view.
Great. Chris, and I had a couple comments.
Well, I want to say something that might be just a tad controversial. I have a lot of empathy for somebody coming from a European system trying to figure out how to navigate the system. It makes me think about having a conversation with the Norwegian health minister, who started by saying, you have to understand that we consider healthcare to be a human right. Mm-hmm. I think in the United States, I think we actually have some of the best healthcare in the world. And depending on what area you're talking about, I think oftentimes we do have the best healthcare in the world. But we always talk about our healthcare system. And as someone that spent most of their life in a big engineering company, we don't have a healthcare system. We have healthcare subsystems. We have random acts of healthcare. Some of them are very impressive, but they're not, a system connects to itself. Our healthcare is not connected to itself. Very hard to navigate. For patients in this country, trying to figure out is very, very hard. And I think we have a larger problem. I think we are making all kinds of progress at subsystem levels, but I think we don't have a system, my opinion.
Not so controversial.
I hear you entirely, and I having just had to of my parent-in-laws go through this whole thing till their end of their lives. It was incredibly complicated and is just very unfair to the patient. So the complexity that a patient faces, particularly without an advocate, is really just, let me call it insane. You know, it really, there is no other almost, you know, word for it. It really is crazy because it doesn't make sense. If you don't have an advocate and you're don't have all of your faculties, you're in some really challenging times. But on the other side of it, some of the beauty of what we do and how this works is it allows us to sort through the messiness, because we are always running one big experiment. You know, that as much as we'd like to think this is all very precise, this is science, and we're learning collectively as a society, even once a drug's launched, how they're applied and how combinations work. And so, unfortunately, the patients are ending up with that complexity right in front of them when they're just very ill-equipped. And Kathy Gusti, who was here yesterday, was talking about how, you know, she takes calls from people that have multiple myeloma, and she'll ask them a bunch of basic questions. And these are often very, well-informed, highly educated patients with resources, and she's just stunned that they don't haven't had the right test or whatever. And she said, I feel like I'm a concierge to the rich and famous, because there's, tens of thousands of people with multiple myeloma and only a few can I take their calls. And so I think that's at the crux of it. It's this patient interface with medicine, and I think you're spot on of one of our biggest challenges.
Okay. Well, look, we have 10 minutes? Okay. It was very good. So why don't we go to the audience and see if there's other questions? I see a hand up, at least one over here.
Thank you. So my name is Yuval Cohen. I'm the CEO of a brand new company focusing on orphan diseases. One of them is cystic fibrosis. And my question to the panel is, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation is a really interesting model, because it's a model where patients banded together in their families and really went out there and started sponsoring research into drugs for their own disease. And they've been wildly successful. Kaleido would not have existed without them. What is the panel's thoughts on that model moving forward and perhaps being emulated by other patient associations?
Well, can I just, I mean, in a way, that's the American Cancer Society, too. I mean, we do a tremendous amount of cancer research. We've got 47 of the researchers that we sponsored, basically, that we funded, went on to win the Nobel Prize. But it's because we're trying to deal with cancer. And we decided that because cancer is not, in this case, not one disease, but a family of diseases. It's over 200 diseases. What we decided to do was take on a special role where we would bring researchers into the business of being researchers. We would get the early investigators started, basically, and try to keep them going until they could go on from there. And I think it's a similar concept, and I think it's a valuable concept. The conundrum for an organization like this, and it's the conundrum for, I think, any not-for-profit organization, is to create a constant revenue stream to allow us to be able to do that.
Actually, it's a very, very interesting question, because, as I said, I've just joined the Michael J. Fox Foundation board, and it has a very different model than the Cystic Fibrosis board or the foundation, because the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, in many ways, has put enough capital into company. So as a guy starting a company, I look at venture folks, I look at disease foundations, and how can I fund the research that will create this important new medicine? So if you have enough resource and there's enough reason to work with that organization that you can replace venture capital, essentially, then it works. If you take the cystic fibrosis model in terms of what the value they will have returned if the product is successful, that can actually inhibit venture capital. And so, it's a strange sort of dynamic, and it's actually something the Michael J. Fox Foundation is wrestling with. And Michael's sort of mantra is, our job is to leave no stone unturned. So they give out much smaller grants that then end up catalyzing more investment, and they structure those grants in a way where they don't inhibit investment, they actually encourage investment and provide a level of validation. So I think there are just different ways, different patient populations, but again, coming back to the patient advocacy foundations, I think they really are an enormous part of our future.
And I would agree. I think that there are multiple models that can work. I think that it is, if the unmet need is there, and there is a voice, a loud voice, which often comes through patients and their advocacy groups, there's usually a way to find the resource to move something forward, and I think that we have to be open to different models. I mean, I think, you know, there was traditionally a big pharma model where everything was developed internally. Biotech was more nimble, could do that quicker. Now you see that we have even smaller biotech, which is the feeder for much of the innovation, and we're seeing it come from many different places. So I think that as long as there is unmet need, there will be a path towards models and unique models that we currently aren't utilizing that will look for these new breakthrough medications. So let's, at this point, I see one more hand up, and that's going to be our final question, and then we're going to do some closing remarks. Your mic is on the way.
Thank you. Sort of a follow-up from the last discussion. Sources of funding, I have to thank the Smith Family Foundation here in Boston who funded my early research, so that's a plug for them. But there are some big potential funders that are entering the arena potentially, namely Google and Apple. And I'd like to know, one, are they just going to bring more money to the table? Or do you see innovation coming from Google and Apple in ways that may advance our understanding of medicine and collection of data?
So maybe I could start with that one. So I think it's an interesting source of capital. I think there are a lot of different untapped sources of capital out there. For example, we've been working at the MassBio to help family offices, people with lots and lots of money, you know, like $1 billion type of folks, find ways to make what they call impact investments because they want to make a difference. They like to deploy capital, and they really care a little less about the returns. They're deep believers in capitalism, so they don't necessarily want to give out grants, but they want to find a way to make a difference. But just by the nature of the way family offices work, they often don't see the opportunities because they stay below the radar because otherwise everybody's out there asking for money for everything. So it's a very sort of interesting dynamic. With Google and Apple, I think it's a very important way they're thinking of participating, but it really has to do probably more with the life science IT space. So in the 2020 report, this is a place which was really highlighted as for Massachusetts, where we're very uniquely positioned to make a big difference here, and companies like Foundation Medicine are. So there's a number of examples, but I was just talking with somebody from Pfizer yesterday. He's a guy who's very high up in the research program. He goes, you know, I look at, you know, pitches for partnerships and people bringing me technology all the time. And he goes, you know, these days I have a very rich pipeline of projects I'm working on. My biggest need is how do I sort through the data? Mm-hmm. So I'm working in this particular area. I have all these databases. I want to pull together, you know, sort of look pattern recognition of how people are responding with different phenotypes, and they come from 4 different databases, and it'll take me 30 days, and that just slows down my cycle time. And he says, so for me, actually, as much as I'm interested in new targets for therapeutics, personally, I'm more interested in finding ways to take the data and allow me to make quicker, better decisions. So I think that's probably where they're going to play a role, and it's perfect timing, I would say.
I'll add just a perspective on that. I think that actually that capital flowing in is helpful in another way as well. I think, first of all, as new groups come to this market, if you will, the one thing that I don't think everyone has an appreciation for is the complex regulatory framework that we have. And I think that there will be some early disappointments about expectations of speed and how you can rapidly move through the system versus what is actually going to be the case. But I think that it will be good in the sense that it could force the dialogue from another stakeholder coming into the picture that has a different perspective on things. And if we can move towards reform where it makes sense so that we can grapple with new technologies like this where we can look at personalized medicine to have an efficient mechanism of getting to market, I think that it serves as actually a very good voice in addition to the capital that it brings. So we are at the conclusion of our panel. So I would just like to make a couple of remarks and then thank each of the panelists here. I think what you heard, very good dialogue. I think that we could extend this another hour. I think we could extend this through the afternoon. I think we could have a whole conference about this. I think it is a complicated issue. And one of the comments that I would make is the worst thing that we can do is not address this and have the conversation. And make sure that we are really, as everyone in this room, delegates of this industry and have an opportunity to shape that discussion in the public and in the public domain. And I think that we all have that responsibility and have to be advocates for this industry because, as I started with, this is a great industry and it has a very promising future, but it is not going to happen on its own. So with that, I'd like to close. I'd like to thank each of the panelists. A very wonderful job that you've done today, and we thank you for your time and efforts. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your perspectives on what continues to be one of MassBio's significant policy issues moving forward. We're going to continue the programming and conversation of value throughout this year, so stay tuned.